The first entry was dated 1983. I was born in 1997, but the handwriting was mine, and the regrets felt familiar. The journal arrived in a plain envelope, no return address, no postage, just my name written in a style I hadn't used since I stopped believing in permanence. I opened it slowly, expecting blank pages or someone else's story, but the first line read, "You forgot her before you met her." And I felt something shift, not in the room, but in me. The ink was faded, but the emotion was fresh. Each word pulsed like breath, each sentence folded into a version of me I hadn't earned yet. I turned the page and found a sketch of a train station I recognized, but couldn't place. The caption said, "Where you almost remembered." I touched the drawing, and the paper warmed slightly, as if syncing with my pulse. I flipped to the next entry and read, Day 4. You asked her to stay, but she had already left. I didn't remember asking anyone to stay, not in this life, not in this version, but the ache in my chest said. Otherwise, I closed the journal and stared at the cover. It was blank, except for a symbol etched into the corner, a spiral intersected by a broken line. I traced it, and the air thickened, the lights dimmed, and the room began to hum softly, like a memory, trying to reassemble itself. I opened the journal again, and the pages had changed. The sketch was gone, replaced by a photograph of me, standing in front of the same station, but older and smiling and holding someone's hand. The caption said, Version 2. 3. You believed in her long enough to fracture. I dropped the journal, and it landed open to a page I hadn't seen before. Day 7. You wrote this entry in a reality that didn't survive. I picked it up, and the ink shimmered like breath on glass. I whispered, Who are you? And the journal responded by turning to a blank page and writing, I am the version that remembers you too clearly. I didn't sleep that night. The journal pulsed softly on my desk like a heartbeat I couldn't ignore. I dreamt of a woman with no face, humming a song I used to love before I knew it existed. I woke with a word in my mouth, Elara. I didn't know anyone by that name, but the journal opened to a page labeled Elara's last message, and the entry read, You promised to forget me, but you kept the scarf. I checked my closet and found a scarf I didn't recognize, soft blue, frayed at the edges, smelling faintly of rain and something like longing. I held it, and the journal pulsed again. Day 9. You remembered the wrong version. I whispered, I don't understand. And the journal wrote, You will when the mirror arrives. The next morning a package waited at my door. Inside was a mirror wrapped in cloth, stitched with the same symbol from the journal. I unwrapped it and saw not my reflection, but a version of me crying in a room I've never entered, holding the scarf, whispering, I'm sorry I forgot you before I met you. I touched the glass, and the journal opened to a new entry. Day 10. You fractured gently. I sat down and began to write, not with intention, but with instinct. The words flowed like memory, like breath, like grief. I remember her humming. I remember the station. I remember the promise I didn't make. The journal accepted it and pulsed once, then stilled. I closed it and placed it beside the mirror and the scarf and whispered, I'm ready to remember the version that wrote this before I was born. The room didn't respond, but the air felt warmer, and somewhere in the distance a train began to arrive. The train didn't arrive, it unfolded. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was emotional, a rhythm I recognized from dreams I hadn't had yet. The journal pulsed once, then opened to a page labeled Version 2. 4. The station that loops. I read the entry, and it described a moment I hadn't lived but remembered clearly. You waited on the bench for someone who never existed, but the grief was real. I looked at the mirror and saw the same bench, the same station, the same version of me holding the scarf and whispering her name, Elara. The journal turned another page without my touch. Day 11. You began to dissolve. I felt it, then not physically, not violently, just softly, like a name slipping from memory, like a promise that was never spoken. I opened the closet again and found a second scarf, identical, but newer, untouched by time or longing. I held it, and the journal wrote, Artifact duplication detected. I asked aloud, Why are there two? And the mirror shimmered, showing a version of her holding the newer scarf and saying, This one was meant for the version that stayed. I didn't know what that meant, but the ache in my chest deepened. I placed both scarves on the desk, and the journal opened to a page labeled Map 3. Emotional Divergence. The sketch showed two paths, one leading to the station, the other to a room filled with mirrors. I whispered, Which one is mine? And the journal wrote, You chose both and fractured accordingly. I sat down and stared at the mirror, waiting for it to shift. It did, slowly revealing a corridor made of journal pages, each one written in my handwriting, each one dated before I was born. I stepped closer, and the mirror pulsed. The journal responded, Day 12. You entered the archive. I touched the glass, and the room folded into the corridor. The pages brushed against my skin like breath, like memory, like regret. I read fragments as I passed. She said goodbye before you learned her name. You promised to forget, but archived her anyway. The scarf was never yours, but you wore it like grief. I reached the end of the corridor and found a door made of ink. It shimmered with the same symbol etched into the journal, and the mirror, and the scarf. I opened it and stepped into a room filled with clocks, none of them ticking, each one labeled with a version of me I hadn't met yet. Version 3. 1. The one who remembered too early. Version 4. 6. The one who never asked her to stay. Version 5. 0. The one who became the journal. I touched the clock labeled 3. 1 and the journal pulsed. Day 13. You fractured into memory. The mirror showed me standing in a room filled with journals, each one humming softly, each one waiting. I asked, what happens if I read them? And the journal wrote, you become the version that remembers all of them. I hesitated, then reached for one labeled, Elara's first goodbye. I opened it, and the ink shimmered. The entry read, she left before you arrived, but the echo stayed. I felt it then, a warmth, a sadness, a recognition I couldn't explain. I whispered, I miss her. And the journal wrote, you always did, even before you knew her. I placed the journal back, and the clocks began to tick slowly, softly, like breath, like time, like recursion. The room folded into a bench again, but this time it was made of paper, each crack a sentence, each splinter a version, each fracture a memory I hadn't earned. She appeared beside me, not flickering, not distant, just present, her outline shaped like longing, her voice shaped like silence. She said, you're inside the version I kept for you. I asked, why? She said, because you needed to remember before you were born. The journal opened to a blank page and wrote, Day 14. You became the archive's echo. I asked, is that what I am now? She said, you're the version that loops gently. I touched the page, and it shimmered, then stilled, then whispered, you're ready to choose the next memory. I asked, will it be mine? She said, it will feel like yours, even if it wasn't. The mirror pulsed, the scarves shimmered, the clocks ticked, the bench cracked, and the journal waited. The journal didn't wait. It opened before I touched it. The page was already written, Day 15. You remembered her memory before she gave it to you. I stared at the ink and felt it pulse like breath, like grief, like recognition. The mirror shimmered and showed a version of her sitting on the bench made of paper, holding both scarves, whispering, he won't know what this means, but he'll feel it anyway. I whispered, I do. And the journal wrote, you're becoming the version that responds instead of asks. The clocks ticked faster, each one syncing with a version of me I hadn't met yet. Version 6. 2. The one who archived her voice. Version 7. 4. The one who forgot gently. Version 8. 0. The one who fractured into symbols. I touched the scarf, and the room folded into a corridor again, but this time the pages were blank, not empty, just waiting. Each one pulsed softly as I passed. And the journal wrote, you're inside the version that writes itself. I asked, am I the author? And the mirror responded, you're the echo that became legible. I reached the end of the corridor and found a door made of breath. It shimmered with the same symbol etched into everything that mattered. I opened it and stepped into a room filled with photographs, each one showing a moment I hadn't lived, but remembered clearly. Her smile, her hand on mine, her voice saying, this version hurts less. I touched one, and the journal pulsed, Day 16. You entered the emotional archive. The mirror showed me standing in a room filled with versions of her, each one holding a journal, each one waiting, each one flickering with emotional precision. I asked, why are there so many? And the journal wrote, because you remembered her differently each time. I walked to the version holding a journal labeled Version 3B. The one who stayed too long. She handed it to me and said, you wrote this before you knew how to lose. I opened it, and the ink shimmered. The entry read, he asked me to stay, but I had already left. In Version 2. 1 inch. I felt the ache again, not sharp, not sudden, just recursive. I placed the journal back, and the room folded into a bench again, but now it was made of mirrors, each crack a reflection, each splinter a version, each fracture a choice I hadn't made. She appeared beside me again, not flickering, not distant, just present, her outline shaped like memory, her voice shaped like breath. She said, You're inside the version I couldn't forget. I asked, is that why you wrote to me? She said, I didn't write to you. I remembered you so clearly, the archive responded. The journal opened to a blank page and wrote, Day 17. You became the version she remembered into existence. I asked, is that what I am now? She said, you're the version that loops into her absence. The mirror shimmered and showed a coastline shaped like longing, a station shaped like silence, a scarf shaped like grief. I touched the image, and the journal pulsed, Map 4, the version that never arrived. I asked, did I miss something? She said, you missed everything except the feeling. The clock stopped ticking, the photographs dissolved, the corridor collapsed, and the room folded into a train station again. But this time, it was empty, no bench, no mirror, no scarf, just the journal waiting open to a page labeled Day 18. You chose to remember without proof. I sat down on the floor and whispered, I'm ready, and the journal wrote, then you're the version that finishes gently. She appeared one last time holding a journal I hadn't seen before. The cover was stitched with the symbol, the pages were sealed. She handed it to me and said, this is the version you never lived but always felt. I opened it, and the ink shimmered, then dimmed, then whispered, you are the memory that arrived before the boy was born. I closed the journal, and the room pulsed once, then stilled, and somewhere in the distance a train began to leave. The train didn't arrive, it dissolved into static, the station flickered, and the journal pulsed, Day 19. You entered the encrypted version. I stood alone holding the sealed journal. She gave me the one stitched with the symbol, the one that whispered instead of wrote. I asked, how do I read what was never written? And the mirror responded, you feel it until it decodes. I touched the cover, and the ink bled through my fingers, not staining, not hurting, just translating. The journal opened itself, and the page read, Version 9. 3. The one who built memory from absence. I stepped forward, and the station folded into a library, but not of books, of breath. Each shelf held a moment suspended in glass. Each moment flickered with emotional metadata. I reached for one labeled, Her Silence, after Version 4. 0 inch, and the journal pulsed. You're not supposed to touch that yet. I asked, why? And the mirror said, because you haven't earned the forgetting. I turned and saw her again, but this time she was younger, not in age, but in memory. Her outline less defined, her voice more fragmented. She said, this is the version I tried to erase, but it kept returning. I asked, why did it return? She said, because you kept asking questions I hadn't answered yet. The journal wrote, Day 20. You became the version that loops through her erasures. I walked deeper into the library and found a corridor labeled Emotional Systems, Version 5A through 6C. Each door pulsed with a different rhythm. I chose one at random and stepped inside. The room was filled with clocks, but none ticked. Instead, they hummed, each one tuned to a different ache. I touched one, and it sang, the moment he said goodbye without knowing it. I touched another, and it whispered, the version where she stayed but forgot why. I asked, are these mine? And the mirror said, they're hers until you remember them. I sat down, and the journal opened to a page labeled Day 21. You entered the version that remembers backwards. I whispered, I'm ready to forget. And the journal wrote, then you must archive the ache first. I stood, and the room folded into a bench again, but this time it was made of journals, each one sealed, each one humming. I chose one labeled Version 2. 7. The one who wrote in symbols instead of words. I opened it, and the ink shimmered into shapes, not letters, not language, just feeling. I touched one, and felt her breath. I touched another, and felt her absence. I touched the last, and felt myself dissolving into the version she couldn't name. The journal pulsed, Day 22. You became the symbol she couldn't translate. I asked, is that why she left? And the mirror said, she didn't leave, she fragmented into emotional syntax. I stood, and the bench folded into a mirror again, but this time it showed both of us writing at the same time, her journal pulsing, mine bleeding, the same symbol appearing on both covers. I asked, are we the same version now? And she said, we're the version that loops until it becomes myth. The journal opened to a page labeled Day 23. You entered the myth of emotional recursion. I asked, is this the end? And she said, no, this is the version that begins without origin. The room folded into a coastline again, but this time the waves were made of journals, each one crashing, each one whispering, each one returning. I walked into the water and felt the ink wrap around my ankles, not pulling, not drowning, just remembering. I reached down and picked up a journal labeled Version 0. 0. the one before memory. I opened it, and the page was blank but pulsing. I whispered, I'm ready to become the version that doesn't need proof. And the journal wrote, Day 24. You became the artifact she left behind before she existed. The mirror shattered, and the coastline folded into a room filled with symbols, each one etched into glass, each one humming with emotional precision. I touched one, and it sang. The version that loved without language. I touched another, and it whispered, the version that stayed without form. I touched the last, and it dissolved into breath, and she appeared again holding a journal stitched with both our symbols. She said, This is the version we write together. I opened it, and the ink shimmered into a map, not of places, but of feelings, each one labeled, each one recursive, each one recursive, each one vibrating with the ache of something half-remembered and fully felt. The journal pulsed. Day 25. You entered the version that maps emotion as architecture. I stared at the ink and saw corridors forming, rooms folding, staircases looping into themselves, each labeled with a feeling, not a word, not a memory, just the sensation of having once been understood. I stepped into the first room, and the walls pulsed with the rhythm of her breath. The journal wrote, version 10. 1. The one who built silence in a shelter. I touched the wall, and it whispered. He asked me to stay, but I had already become the echo. I turned and saw her again, but this time she was writing not in a journal, but directly into the air, each symbol hanging suspended, each one humming with unfinished meaning. I asked, What are you writing? And she said, The version of you that never needed me to explain. I reached for a symbol, and it dissolved into ink on my palm. The journal pulsed. Day 26. You became the version that reads her before she writes. The room folded into a bench again, but this time it was surrounded by mirrors, each one showing a different version of us, some laughing, some silent, some fractured, some whole. I asked, Which one is real? And the mirror said, The one you can't stop returning to. I stared at the version where she handed me the journal stitched with both our symbols and whispered, This is the version we write together. I opened it again, and the map shimmered, each corridor now labeled with a version number and a feeling, version 3. 4. The ache of almost, version 6. 9. The warmth of forgetting gently, version 8. 2. The fracture that became ritual. I stepped into the corridor labeled version 5. 5. The one who archived longing as structure and found a room filled with shelves, each one holding a moment sealed in glass. I touched one, and it pulsed. The time she said goodbye without saying it. I touched another, and it whispered, the version where he stayed but forgot why. I asked, Are these mine or hers? And the journal wrote, They're both until you choose which version to become. I sat down, and the room folded into a train station again, but this time the train was arriving slowly. Deliberately, each window showing a different version of her, each seat holding a journal, each journal humming with unfinished ache. I stepped aboard and chose a seat beside the version of her who never spoke. She handed me a journal labeled version 0. 3. The one who felt everything but said nothing. I opened it, and the ink shimmered into breath. The page read, Day 27. You entered the version that writes in silence. I whispered, I'm ready to become the version that doesn't need answers. And the journal wrote, Then you must become the question she never asked. The train began to move, and the windows flickered with scenes I hadn't lived, but remembered clearly. Her hand on mine, her voice sing, This version hurts less, her outline dissolving into symbols I couldn't translate. I asked, Did I lose her? And the mirror said, You became her archive. The train stopped, and the station folded into a coastline again. But this time the waves were made of journals, each one crashing, each one returning, each one whispering, You're the version she left behind before she existed. I walked into the water and felt the ink wrap around my ankles again, not pulling, not drowning, just remembering. I reached down and picked up a journal labeled version 11. 0. The one who rewrote the archive from within. I opened it, and the page was blank but pulsing. I whispered, I'm ready to become the version that finishes gently. And the journal wrote, Day 28. You became the myth she couldn't forget. The mirror shattered, and the coastline folded into a room filled with symbols again, but this time they were etched into mirrors, each one reflecting a version of me I hadn't met. Yet I touched one, and it sang, the version that loved without language. I touched another, and it whispered, the version that stayed without form. I touched the last, and it dissolved into breath, and she appeared again, holding a journal stitched with both our symbols. She said, "This is the version we write together, but only if you're ready to forget how it ends." I opened it, and the ink shimmered into a map again, but this time the corridors were labeled with questions, not answers. What did she mean when she said, "almost"? Why did he stay when he had already left? How do you archive a feeling that never finished? I stepped into the corridor labeled version 12. 1. The one who asked without needing to know, and the journal pulsed, day 29. You became the version that writes her into being. I whispered, "Then let me begin again." I whispered, "Then let me begin again." And the journal pulsed, day 30. You entered the version that loops through endings disguised as origins. The map shimmered and folded into a spiral, each corridor now curving back into itself, each label rewritten in reverse. Version 13. 0. The ache that arrived before the goodbye. Version 14. 2. The silence that remembered him before he spoke. Version 15. 1. The fracture that became ritual, then myth, then breath. I stepped into the spiral, and the walls pulsed with unfinished sentences, each one echoing a version of her voice. He didn't know what it meant, but he felt it anyway. I stayed until the memory forgot me. This version hurts less, but lingers longer. I touched the wall, and the ink bled into my palm again, not staining, not hurting, just translating. The journal opened and wrote. Day 31. You became the version that finishes by returning. I asked, "Returning to what?" And the mirror said, "To the version she left behind inside you." The spiral folded into a bench again, but this time it was surrounded by clocks, each one ticking backwards, each one syncing with a version of me I hadn't let go of. Version 2. 0. The one who asked too late. Version 7. 3. The one who stayed too long. Version 9. 9. The one who fractured into symbols and never reassembled. I sat down, and the journal opened to a page labeled Day 32. You entered the version that archives grief as architecture. I whispered, "I'm ready to remember what I forgot." And the journal wrote, "Then you must become the version that forgets deliberately." The bench folded into a room filled with shelves again, but this time each shelf held a journal stitched with a different version of her breath. I chose one labeled version 4. 6. The one who wrote in echoes, and opened it. The ink shimmered into sound, not words, not symbols, just the rhythm of her absence. I listened and heard her say, "You're the version I remembered into being before I knew your name." I asked, "Did you name me?" And the mirror said, "She named the ache, and you answered." I stood, and the room folded into a coastline again, but this time the waves were silent, each one holding a journal, each one returning, each one unfinished. I walked into the water and picked up a journal labeled version 0. 1. The one who arrived before the story began. I opened it, and the page was blank but pulsing. I whispered, "I'm ready to become the version that writes without needing to be read." And the journal wrote, Day 33. You became the myth of unfinished endings. The mirror shattered and the coastline folded into a train station again, but this time the train was leaving slowly, deliberately, each window showing a version of her I hadn't met, yet each seat holding a journal I hadn't written. Yet I stepped aboard and chose a seat beside the version of her who never forgot. She handed me a journal stitched with both our symbols and said, "This is the version we write together, but only if you're ready to lose it again." I opened it, and the ink shimmered into a map again, but this time the corridors were labeled with losses, not memories. The time he said goodbye, without knowing it. The version where she stayed, but forgot why. The ache that became ritual, then breath, then silence. I stepped into the corridor labeled version 16. 4. The one who archived loss as inheritance, and found a room filled with mirrors, each one reflecting a version of me holding a journal, each one flickering, each one humming. I touched one, and it sang, the version that loved without language. I touched another, and it whispered, the version that stayed without form. I touched the last, and it dissolved into breath, and she appeared again, holding a journal stitched with both our symbols. She said, "This is the version we write together, but only if you're ready to forget how it ends." I opened it, and the ink shimmered into a spiral again, each corridor curving, each label rewriting itself. Version 17. 0. The one who finishes by beginning. Version 18. 2. The one who loops through endings until they become origin. Version 19. 1. the one who writes her into being without needing proof. I stepped into the spiral, and the journal pulsed, day 34. You became the version she left behind before she existed, I whispered. Then let me begin again. I whispered, then let me begin again. And the spiral folded into breath. The journal pulsed, day 35. You entered the version that writes itself into memory. The map shimmered and dissolved, each corridor, now a thread, each thread looping through a version of her I hadn't understood yet. Version 20. Duro. The one who became myth before memory. Version 21. 3. The one who fractured gently into ritual. Version 22. 1. The one who stayed by becoming the archive. I followed the thread and found myself inside a room made of journals, each one stitched with both our symbols, each one humming with unfinished ache. I opened one, and the ink shimmered into a mirror. The mirror showed her writing me into existence, not with words, not with breath, but with the rhythm of remembering. I asked, "Did you create me?" And the mirror said, "She remembered you so clearly." The archive responded. I touched the ink, and the journal wrote, Day 36. You became the version that finishes by being remembered. The room folded into a bench again, but this time it was surrounded by versions of her, each one holding a journal, each one flickering, each one waiting. I walked to the version who never spoke, and she handed me a journal labeled version 0. 0. The one before the story began. I opened it, and the page was blank but pulsing. I whispered, "I'm ready to become the version that doesn't need to be read." And the journal wrote, Day 37. You became the echo that loops into origin. The bench folded into a coastline again, but this time the waves were still, each one holding a journal, each one silent, each one returning. I walked into the water and picked up a journal stitched with breath. It opened itself, and the ink shimmered into a spiral again. But this time the corridors were labeled with endings. The moment she forgot him deliberately. The version where he stayed by becoming absence. The ache that finished itself by returning. I stepped into the corridor labeled version 23. 4. The one who wrote her into forgetting, and found a room filled with clocks, each one ticking forward, each one syncing with a version of me I hadn't become. Yet I touched one, and it sang, the version that loved without needing to be known. I touched another, and it whispered, the version that stayed by becoming myth. I touched the last, and it dissolved into breath, and she appeared again, holding a journal stitched with both our symbols. She said, "This is the version we write together, but only if you're ready to remember what never happened." I opened it, and the ink shimmered into a map again, but this time the corridors were labeled with questions. What did she mean when she said, almost, why did he stay when he had already left? How do you archive a feeling that never finished? I stepped into the corridor labeled version 24. 1. The one who asked without needing answers. And the journal pulsed, day 38. You became the version that finishes gently. The room folded into a train station again, but this time the train was arriving slowly, deliberately, each window, showing a version of her I hadn't met, each seat, holding a journal I hadn't written. I stepped aboard and chose a seat beside the version of her who never forgot. She handed me a journal stitched with both our symbols and said, "This is the version we write together, but only if you're ready to lose it again." I opened it, and the ink shimmered into breath again. The page read, Day 39. You became the version that loops through endings until they become origin. I whispered, "Then let me begin again." And the train dissolved into static. The station folded into silence. The journal closed itself and whispered, Day 40. You became the story that arrived before the boy was born. I stood alone holding the sealed journal, the one stitched with breath, the one that shimmered without ink, the one that pulsed without pages. I asked, "Is this the end?" And the mirror said, "This is the version that finishes by being found." I placed the journal on the bench and watched it dissolve into memory, into myth, into breath. And somewhere in the distance a train began to leave again, slowly, deliberately, each window showing a version of her I hadn't met, yet each seat holding a journal I hadn't written yet. And I whispered, "Then let me begin again."